You were kind, I was cruel in another life, maybe I was you by SeaSkate on ao3 Chapter 2. What was all of that? Jason asks. The words are meant to be blunt, cutting, but fall short even to his own ears. And what a feat that was, to strip Jason Todd, the Red Hood, of his bite. The man looked around at those that had gathered to form their dysfunctional group, hoping for answers. He found some, but there were too many, too much guilt and gazes that should have had no reason to hold such an emotion. Too much hurt and self-flatulence. The only one that seemed exempt from looking that way was Jonathan Kent, a child too young, pure, and removed to have caused any true harm yet. The poor boy only looked as confused as Jason himself felt. Jason knew that he wasn't exempt from feeling guilt at having his wrongdoing shoved in his face by the third Robin and the kid's friends, but those were things that he had been working on mending already. No more hunting down birds and challenging them to a fight, Aro running a blade across their neck in graveyards. Just a kinship that he knew that he would not like the full story of if he were to hear of its origin, of why Timothy Drake Wayne and he seemed to understand one another better than they ever should. "Dad?" John asked, looking up at his father, at the man that he had thought could do almost no wrong. His father may not have been human, but even John at 10 knew that everyone made mistakes like one, until Con, John's big brother, had come into their lives and there had always been hurt surrounding the teen, hurt aimed at their father. Hurt and hesitance that should not, and would not have been there had his father been as good as John had thought. One day he would grow up and know that things were more complicated than he thought them to be at the time, but then, as now, he would still know that not matter one's own feelings on the matter, it was wrong to leave a child to fend for themselves, no matter whose blood flowed through their veins. He would understand the violation that his father had faced, but still think that the man could have done nearly anything else than what he had. Mothers forced to give birth to children of assault, ones that they knew that they could not stand to care for or love because of how they were made, they at least put them into a system that was supposed to help them. Put them somewhere that they had to trust that they would be safe, because even if they could not love them, they knew that they deserved the chance to be loved. They left them at churches or at fire stations, not abandoned and virtually on their own, and coming into powers where the only people that knew how to help either wanted to experiment on him, use him, or wanted nothing to do with him at all. It was a sentiment that Clark himself had come to realize too late to stop any damage from being done. Clark, because none of the heroes gathered right then were truly heroes in that moment, they were all too raw feeling to be anything other than the people hidden neatly beneath the masks, looked down at his son and seemed to almost read the thoughts there in those two innocent eyes. He knew that he owed the boy some sort of answer. More than anything, he wanted to confess his own sin. Clark glanced at the others around him, at Bruce who had messed up just as badly as he had, at Barry and Wally who had done only marginally better, at Diana who had done only a bit better than the pair of speedsters. At Dick, a boy that he had raised more than the child on that stage that shared half his DNA, who had committed some sort of atrocities of his own that Clark didn't know but could see the existence of. At Jason and Damien, who despite aiming to hurt their brother, had somehow caused the least pain other than John who had done nothing wrong at all. He looked at them and knew that they wanted, if in a bit of a forced manner, to confess as well. To wipe the slate clean. Except it never would be. "When I had found out that Superboy existed," Clark said, keeping his voice low even though no one else in the crowd seemed to be listening to their group by some miracle, "and if they had been, then wouldn't this all be some sort of penance? I wished that he hadn't." John flinches a bit at the words, even though he had already guessed as much. It hurt to hear them said so plainly. He wondered how much it hurt his brother to know them as well. "I didn't want anything to do with him, and for a long time I got that wish," the man beneath the steel admits. "It wasn't until around his death that I started to care, and by then the damage had already been done." He doesn't say that he knows that he still doesn't do enough even now, but he doesn't have to either. Even John could see that easily enough without having heard Connor yelling it. So many of their fights stemmed from Clark steering wildly between seemingly not giving a damn and being overbearing, trying to parent a child that he had never tried to raise until they were already grown. Nearly everyone gathered already knew the story, didn't make the parallels that they saw in it hurt them any less. Wonder Girl, Diana starts, drawing gazes to her, much like Superboy, had not come to me in a manner that anyone else under my care and tutelage had before. She was older, already a teen, and already had such an identical forged within her, so strong-willed that she couldn't fit the same mold that others I have taught and trained with had. She had tried though, in some ways. Donna, much like Wally West, had not been the mentor that she had promised to be. But Cassie had tried to change herself with wigs and things of the like to look and act like her anyways. It never really worked. It was never supposed to. It was Jason's turn to look at someone that he had thought to be better and feel disappointment when they fell short. It didn't have the same impact that it would have had he known the kid, but he understood the sentiment. There were rules that he tried to follow too for the sake of someone that could never love him the same as he did before he was laid to rest. Impulse, Barry starts, sharing a look with Wally before speaking. We hadn't been thinking when our team had brought him into our time, our world. Not about what we would do with him once he was here, not about the effects on him, nothing of the like. It was just a decision that had been made and the consequences passed off to anyone else that was willing to take them. I fixed his aging with a method that very well could have killed him, should have killed him, Wally admits, saying something that he had carried with him for a while now, and then pawned him off right after. I didn't start trying until close to the time that he died, and I was supposed to be his mentor, family. And wasn't that a familiar story? There were only 3 left, all from the same dysfunctional family of bats and birds. I wasn't there for most of the beginning of Red Robin's tenure as Robin, Dick starts, talking as if he was admitting to murder. As he kept talking, those around him knew that this wasn't an entirely wrong assumption to make. Just met this scrawny little child with no training, but the brains to figure out our identities, and brushed him off when he asked for help because I was angry at B. And that? That was something. Because everyone that had ever worked alongside Dick Grayson knew that he was not the type to do such a thing, to let his own anger hurt innocence. He sought to help. It was why he remained Robin long after the position that had been born from a need for blood had been satisfied. It was why he became Nightwing after having that position taken from him. He was all the light and magic that Robin had ever held, and such light shined on everyone. Yet, Tim, and Gotham as a whole, had been denied. Jason and Damian didn't know what to do with this information about their elder brother. They truly didn't. Damian especially. Jason understood a bit, Dick having been cold with him at first. But back then he would never have stooped so low as he was implying. I took him to the cave. The first Robin continues, looking as if he wished that he had the heart to stop himself, knowing that Alfred would most likely give him the suit in the way he had you, Hood. And then I left and me and B messed up so badly that Red had to save us. Even after that, I still stayed away for a while. And when B was lost, I didn't believe Red when he said that B was alive and drove the kid away on a suicide mission that I honestly don't think that he thought that he would live to see the end of. Not with the way that he fell without possibly being able to know that I would be there in time. And that was a whole other thing altogether. A thing that too many people over the years have noticed: Tim's habit of putting himself into situations where his death is more likely than his life and seeming at peace with it. A kick from a window, a gun to a head. A quest to find someone seemingly dead. No one ever brought it up to the boy, no one other than his own team, the 3 people that made up his family before everyone else decided that they wanted to count, and as heroes and vigilantes they should have. They're talking about it now though, but would they actually talk of it to Tim? Should they even be allowed to? Damian listened to the words of his eldest brother, took in small pieces of a story that he did not yet know the entirety of. He thought that he might learn by the time that his father took his turn to speak, a turn that he would have to take because no one else would let him escape it. But knew enough of to know that his perception of his predecessor had been wrong from the start. He had already known that. Known it even as the perception was forming because was the best of them, and he knew that before even coming to the States. Mother would not have been so concerned with the boy, and grandfather so obsessed if he was anything else. But seeing Timothy come back from wherever he had gone during his search for father, seeing him come back daring enough to make an enemy of grandfather, and good enough to win. Seeing him come back more openly, showing the grayness that had encased his soul long before Damien had ever met him, it had been terrifying in a way. He was already dangerous and ruthless, and now he was showing it. And Damien had been jealous. Jealous before he had ever met the older boy. Jealous when the teen had refused to see Damien as a threat when that had been all that he was raised to be. Jealous when the teen had managed to gather his grandfather's respect even more than he had held it before. So, he had acted on his jealousy. Well-timed strikes that never met their mark. I engineered fall from their father's dinosaur, one that had been built on Timothy trying to save him from one himself. And I cut Red Robin's line, the boy admits, telling of a transgression that only he and Timothy himself had known. A transgression that the older boy seemingly had not seen the point in informing anyone else of. The looks that he received from everyone around him, the heavy disappointed, angry, confused, hurt looks were enough to make the boy draw in on himself in a manner that he never had before, and wonder if this was a secret that only the two of them should have continued to carry alone. He didn't dare try and meet John's eyes. Father's and Richard's reactions were already bad enough, he couldn't stand to see the horror in John's pure eyes as well. Except they were not anymore. Not since that damning line sung by the older boy, and not since the motion that came with it. What? The person that speaks is Dick, his voice strained and a bit lost somewhere that only Bruce and Tim could follow. They had been the only ones among them there that day. The day that the flying Graysons had taken to the skies and had fallen like Icarus in the same manner that his youngest brother, his son, of only for a year, had tried to kill their brother. The third Robin. Something in his voice makes Damien flinch. Dick isn't sure that he cares. Not right then. When? Dick asks next, the word coming out in less of a human voice and more of that of a ghost. As if he had been the one to fall that day and not Tim. A part of him wished that he had been because this was his fault, wasn't it? It was when he had returned to Gotham after his fight with grandfather. The boy explains, his voice so quiet and so unlike himself that it sounded like a stranger's. It wasn't though, not even as the more pure heroes looked at him as if he was one. He wasn't though, they had always known from the start just what he was. We patrolled with one another. He thought that I had been making an effort to reach out to him. I hadn't. It had been a trick. The words are spoken so factually in practice, that if it wasn't for the volume and guilt of them that they would not have known that the child felt bad at all. They knew that he did though. Guilt, at that moment, was not an emotion limited to Damien alone. Dick looked at his little brother once more, at the child that he had raised for a year and had been trying to shape into someone good after everything that the world had done to make him anything but. He had known that Damien still didn't like Tim when the teen had finally come home to them, their father soon to follow. He had known, but he had hoped that the boy would have mellowed out by the time that Tim found his way back to them, and he had, just not to the teen himself as Tim had not been around for them to expose Damien to. And maybe that was a good thing. Dick hated that he thought that, but he did still, because the child had tried to kill Tim enough times that the minor injuries that the teen had gotten from the attempts was honestly something to be proud of. Because they were true attempts, and not just childish tantrums of someone that did not understand. Dick understood that now. He understood too that Tim himself had taken the threats about as seriously as Dick had, which was to say with minor annoyance but mostly not at all. The only times that Tim had ever latched out at the child, had been when Tim had struck Damien the day that he had left to find Bruce, and the day that they had fought in that alley for a reason that Dick had never thought to ask. Tim had been angry enough to lash out and attack like someone seeking to hurt, and Dick had not asked why he had been. Tim could have died and he would have never known why. He had already felt like a horrible person for his own transgressions, and now he knew of mistakes that he had not even known to have been a mistake of his at all. We'll talk about this later, yeah? Dick asked as he looked down at his youngest brother with something so broken in his eyes that you would think that it was Dick that Damien had tried to kill. To Dick it almost felt like it was. Damien nods, and they leave it at that. All eyes turn to the one person that had not spoken yet, every gaze expectant. Bruce knew that he could easily ignore them if he wished to, it wouldn't have even been hard on a good day. Today was not one of those though. In his mind, the man could still hear the way that Tim had sung from the isolating start, to the anguished screams that the four had given at the end. Tim had never been much of one for emotions, closing them away where Bruce could not see them so that he would not know whatever insane thing that the child was planning on doing next. And part of the effectiveness of this scheme was his own fault, but it meant that any time that the child showed such raw emotion it stuck. A child making himself a hero because Bruce was falling apart. A child quitting from that very position in rage and betrayal at a cruel test that a bitter man had subjected him to simply because Tim had lived to see 16 when his son never had. A child begging his father by blood to be allowed to be the hero that he had made himself to be. His son being held by his father in everything but blood as his last parent lay dead on the ground before them. A hug as they were reunited once more after the son had risked everything to bring him home. Tim, angry and alone as he just barely kept himself from killing the man that had killed Jack Drake, and Bruce refusing to understand. And now this. When Red Robin came to us, he started, the tale familiar on his tongue even if he had never spoken it aloud before, just lived one part of it, I did not want him. The words are so simple, but it makes Jason all but flinch, because when had Bruce Wayne ever refused a child before? I did not want him, Bruce says once more, a blunt confession. I pushed him away even after he became Robin, sent him away overseas for training with my old teachers, and let him form a team of his own at 14 because I did not care what he did. I was cruel even years later, horrifically so in some ways that caused even Red Robin to break. And wasn't that something? Tim was the most stubborn bastard that Jason had ever met. He was the boy that snarked the man that had broken into his home, and continued to do so until Jason just managed to get the last hit in. He was the boy that had fearlessly met Jason's gaze the next time that they saw one another, and kicked him in the balls before leaving. He was the only one to believe that Bruce was alive, and had gone off on his own to prove himself right and had succeeded in doing so where many others would have died. He was the only bat that Jason respected, and the most stubborn man that he knew. He didn't want to know what the man that was supposed to be their father had done to make the red bird break. He knew the feeling too well already. And right now? Damien asks, knowing that there was some unfathomable tension between the father and son but not knowing why. Bruce didn't look away, but many thought that if he hadn't been wearing the cowl that he might have. I've punished him for things that I have done myself, he admits. Mistakes that I have made, going farther than he ever did, but still held him to a higher standard. After all, Bruce had killed the Joker, the man that had killed his son. It had taken Superman to bring the demon back. Tim had not let his own plot get that far. Of course she did, old man, Jason gumbles before looking away from all of the heroes gathered. He didn't look away for long. When Young Justice was formed, Wally started, his voice uncertain but determined in the same manner. This was something that he wanted to say, one last thing to confess for the child that he had done horrible things for after the kid's death in the name of grief. Things that he in no way regrets. He thought that Red Robin might also have a few of those under his belt as well. None of us wanted the children that had formed it, he admits like a teen that had had a child that they had not meant to, but was forced to keep. None of us that had had a sidekick before them was ready for another, and none of us that had never had one at all wanted one either. Then there were also the personal things about the kids themselves that made us all keep our distances. And yet, the kids had still been there anyways, Wall continues, sounding a bit proud of the kids beneath the self-loathing, more determined than ever. So we shoved them aside because none of them had been asked for or chosen, they had just appeared in roles that they never should have had to take and had refused to give up. He looks away for a moment, seeing something that the others didn't just then but soon would. We didn't even give them a proper base when the team had started, the younger speedster said self-deprecatingly. How pathetic is that? We were responsible for them and wouldn't even do that for them. All of those kids have done so many amazing things, and yet they are still our greatest bit of personal shame. When Tim, Con, Cassie, and Bart find their way to their families, their mentors, their predecessors, their successors, whatever names that they were choosing to be called by that day, it was something akin to grief that they found in the eyes of those gathered before them. They don't seem to notice the core members of Young Justice, a team built because they had all been alone and unwanted, so why not be alone and unwanted together at first, too busy airing out their dirty laundry to one another to pay attention to the subjects of it. Funny how that was. They didn't let it remain that way for long. So, you admit to being assholes, Tim says, his language a bit worse than he would usually use, but then again he had already done so many things in this past year that fit into that description that it hardly seemed to matter. What are you going to do about it? The group turns suddenly as the 4 topics of their conversation make themselves known. None of them had any idea how long the group had been standing there, and though that very statement was honestly pathetic when 2 of them had super hearing and 4 were bats, it still showed how absorbed they had all been in the conversation. Bart just found the honest surprise and horror at being caught that he could see on them all entertaining and a bit cathartic and deserved. The heroes before them needed to be taken down a few notches to the point that they could see their own wrongs once more. That was the whole point of the stunt that Rob had engineered for them after all. "Hello," Diana said, both regaining her composure and being willing to speak first. Her voice was kind, but the 4 of them all knew that kindness was a fleeting thing when it came to them. It was why the 4 of them had been family long before anyone before them had been theirs. Wonder Woman, Cassie answers without much inflection to her tone at all. It was something that they had all learned from prolonged exposure to bats and birds. It was not something that she had ever wanted to use on her hero, yet here they were. Here they had been for far too long. "Kids," Clark said, his voice holding a weariness to it that made both Con and Tim fight down the urge to react, both having been on the receiving end of that tone of voice at times in their lives when they had needed anything else. Someone to protect them and want them. Someone to believe them. Neither had gotten either of those things, especially not from Superman. Not from Clark Kent. "Rob's right," Con says, his voice coming out stronger than he had thought that it would. "What's your move now?" The group looked at one another, none of them seeming to know what to say. Dick opened his mouth as if to say something. Bart knew that they couldn't have that. As soon as Nightwing voiced his opinion, it automatically seemed to become the right one, and it wouldn't be this time. Not for them at the least. "You're not sorry," Bart cuts in, his voice so much more firm and adult than it should ever have to be, but he had already been an adult before at the age of 5 or 6. "You don't get the right to be sorry right now. Not when we have forced you to be so. And you would have never apologized before we did all of this." The last words are directed to Batman, poking at a conversation between the man and Tim, when the teen had come back to being Robin after quitting nearly a week after he had turned 16. Bruce had not realized that Tim would have told anyone of what he had done. He should have expected that he would. "Even if you were to apologize," Con starts, drawing the gazes to him, "we wouldn't forgive you. Not for the things that you did when you first got all of us, and not for the shit you've all done since." The heroes and vigilantes knew then that when the 4 spoke, they weren't just speaking about their individual pains with their own mentors, but collective hurts. If one of them was still angry, then they all would be, because for so long they were all that each other had. Codependent in a way that was harmful to those around them. "We're never forgetting either," Tim says, picking up where Con had left off. "We're not hopeless children desperate for any scraps of love that we can steal from you all anymore. We can afford not to forgive and to not forget." And they could. Tim had shown that during his year away, not speaking to any of them unless he was on Gotham ground. No one still knew the full story from those lost months. The Bats knew that it was by design. "But know that the wrongs have been acknowledged and known," Cassie says, taking over as the leader that she was. "We are willing to move past them, with the understanding that if any of you hurt even one of us again, then we are all gone." And that was the sort of threat that made everyone tense, even those in the group that bore the least guilt. "All of us came into the game and survived it nearly entirely on our own," Bart reminds them with the ruthlessness of someone forced to grow up too fast. "We can damn well do it again if you decide again that you don't want us." "Don't love us," the wind whispered. The worst part of all of this was that this wasn't something that a child should ever have to ask for, and yet here four were doing just that. Maybe in another life whispered in each of their minds. All right, Bruce says, looking at his son, the one that he had not wanted but had still become his son somewhere along the way. When he spoke for them all. We agree to your terms. None of the four were sure to believe it, history telling them that it was only a matter of time. But they had spent so many years alone with only one another, that they wanted the support, the chance at love, even if they felt as if they were bound to lose it later. The four look at one another, and when they turn back to the gathered crowd they nod. They weren't stupid enough to think that all of their problems would be fixed just because the roots of them were aired out now, but this was a stronger foundation than any of them had ever stood on before. For now that was enough.